There is a reason you found this message now, and before this conversation reaches its end, that reason will no longer feel mysterious. It will feel undeniable. What is approaching on May 31st is not an event designed for the masses. In fact, most people will move through it without recognizing that anything meaningful occurred at all. Yet for a very specific group of individuals, this moment marks the opening of a threshold that has remained dormant for years, waiting for the exact alignment that is now arriving. This is not simply another full moon. It is not the familiar monthly climax of lunar energy that briefly stirs emotions before fading back into ordinary life. What is emerging on May 31st carries a very different quality. It arrives as a blue moon portal, the second full moon within the same calendar month, appearing at the precise conclusion of a period of suspension that has been quietly unfolding beneath the surface. The last 3 days were not random. They were a pause, a gathering, a holding of breath before release. And what is about to be released has the power to create a visible divide between those who recognize the moment and those who do not. A divide that will continue revealing itself through choices, opportunities, and outcomes for many months to come. There are two kinds of people standing before this doorway. The first group will experience this lunar event exactly the way they experience every other full moon. They may notice stronger emotions. They may sleep differently. They may feel unusually reactive, unusually sentimental, or strangely restless. They will search for ordinary explanations. They will blame stress, exhaustion, responsibilities, circumstances, or simply the weight of a difficult week. They will move through the portal without realizing it existed. The energy will arrive, peak, and pass. Then life will continue exactly as before. The opening that appeared for them will quietly close, unnoticed and unused. But there is another group, a much smaller group. These are the souls who have not spent recent days running from themselves. These are the individuals who felt something slowing down inside them and chose to listen rather than escape. They noticed the silence. They sat with questions they could no longer avoid. They allowed uncomfortable truths to rise into awareness instead of drowning them beneath endless distractions, obligations, scrolling, noise, and manufactured urgency. During these past days, they began seeing things that had been hidden beneath constant movement. They began recognizing answers that had been trying to reach them for a very long time. And if you are hearing these words now, there is a reason they feel familiar. Deep down, you already know which group you belong to. Something inside you has been sensing this shift long before anyone put language around it. Perhaps you could not explain it. Perhaps you tried to ignore it. Yet the feeling remained. An awareness that something important was gathering just beyond the edge of visibility. That awareness is not accidental. Those who are prepared for a new chapter rarely receive a dramatic announcement from the outside world. Instead, they begin feeling an internal resonance before the event arrives. They are drawn toward the information they need because their inner world has already started aligning with what is coming next. Readiness attracts revelation. Clarity finds the person prepared to receive it. And somewhere within you, there is already a recognition that what unfolds on May 31st carries significance that many people around you may never fully understand. Over the next few moments, we will explore what this blue moon portal truly represents beyond the simplified explanations repeated across the internet. We will examine why the period extending from May 31st through June 3rd carries unusual energetic importance. We will explore what becomes possible for those who are prepared when this doorway opens, what it actually means to step into a different timeline, and why the decisions made around the opening of this portal may influence far more than most people realize. Most importantly, we will look at the mistakes that can close an opportunity as quickly as it appears. Because timing matters. Awareness matters. Presence matters. Before we continue, take a moment and acknowledge what you've already been feeling. If a quiet part of you has sensed that something meaningful is approaching, if you have felt anticipation without knowing exactly why, then you are not responding to someone else's certainty. You are responding to your own intuition. Sometimes the most powerful confirmation comes when another voice simply names what your spirit has already recognized. And that brings us to the deeper truth about the blue moon itself. Most discussions stop at a surface definition, a second full moon within the same calendar month. Rare, interesting, unusual. But that description barely scratches the surface of what such a moment represents energetically. A traditional full moon follows a rhythm that has accompanied human life for generations. It rises, reaches culmination, illuminates what was hidden, and then gradually releases its hold. Every full moon completes a cycle while simultaneously initiating another. Every full moon exposes something that has been developing beneath awareness. Every full moon offers an opportunity to let go of what can no longer travel forward. This process happens whether people consciously engage with it or not. The difference lies in awareness. Those who understand the rhythm work with it. They recognize the messages, respond to the invitations, and use the energy available to them. Those who remain disconnected simply experience the emotional symptoms without understanding their source. They feel the wave, but they never learn how to ride it. And that distinction becomes especially important as we move deeper into understanding why this particular lunar gateway is unlike anything ordinary. What makes a blue moon so powerful is not that it simply magnifies an ordinary full moon. The difference runs much deeper than intensity alone. A regular lunar culmination follows a familiar pattern. It illuminates, it reveals, it releases, and then it gradually dissolves back into the background of daily life. A blue moon operates on an entirely different level. Rather than highlighting a single moment within a cycle, it gathers the entire emotional, spiritual, and psychological journey of that cycle and concentrates it into one unmistakable point of recognition. Imagine every insight that has quietly been moving toward you throughout this month. Imagine every subtle realization that appeared for a moment and then disappeared before you could fully grasp it. Imagine every truth that knocked softly on the door of your awareness, every unanswered question that lingered in the back of your mind, every feeling you sensed but could not quite explain. The blue moon does not create those things. It collects them, it gathers them together, it pulls them into focus. Then it places them directly in front of you in a form that can no longer be ignored. This is why the portal opening on May 31st carries a different energetic signature from an ordinary full moon. A standard full moon may illuminate one area of your life. It may draw attention to one relationship, one decision, one emotional pattern, or one unresolved situation. The blue moon works across a broader landscape. It reveals the entire storyline that has been unfolding beneath the surface. It allows you to see where you began, where you stand now, and where all of these experiences have quietly been guiding you. Suddenly, events that seemed disconnected begin forming a coherent picture. Feelings that appeared confusing begin making sense. Experiences that felt random begin revealing a hidden pattern. What becomes visible is not merely a moment. It is a trajectory. It is movement. It is evidence of transformation that has been occurring even during periods when you believed nothing was changing at all. And this particular blue moon on May 31st carries an additional layer of significance. Its importance does not arise solely from the rarity of the lunar event itself. Its power comes from the month it concludes. Those who have been paying attention know that this month has not felt ordinary. It has carried unusual depth, unusual emotional density, unusual opportunities for reflection. Earlier in the month, the Scorpio full moon initiated a process that many people felt deeply, whether they could explain it or not. Hidden truths surfaced. Emotional defenses weakened. Long-avoided realities demanded acknowledgement. What had been buried began emerging into view. Then came the stillness of the days that followed. The pause. The strange sense that movement had slowed while something essential continued unfolding beneath the surface. For many, this period felt uncomfortable. Human beings are conditioned to associate progress with action, yet sometimes the most important changes happen during moments when nothing visible appears to be happening at all. The silence that followed was not empty. It was purposeful. It created the space necessary for revelations to settle. It allowed confusion to separate from truth. It provided enough distance for deeper understanding to emerge. And now the blue moon arrives as the final movement in a process that has been unfolding since the beginning of the month. If the first phase exposed what needed attention, and the second phase created space for understanding, then this third phase delivers resolution. This is why the energy surrounding May 31st feels different. It carries the weight of completion. It carries the authority of a chapter reaching its final page. Three-part sequences possess a unique power because they allow transformation to mature fully. A single event can start change. A second event can deepen it. But the third event often determines whether the change becomes permanent. For those who have remained conscious throughout this journey, what concludes now is not merely a cycle on a calendar. It is the uncertainty that has lingered beneath awareness. It is the feeling of standing between worlds. It is the exhausting state of almost knowing something without being able to fully articulate it. It is the suspension that has kept you waiting for confirmation. The hesitation, the questioning, the internal negotiations, the constant sense that clarity was near but never fully arrived, all of that reaches its point of resolution here. The fog begins to thin, the waiting begins to end, the pieces begin connecting. And on the other side of that connection is something profoundly important. It is the first clear glimpse of the timeline that is waiting for you next. Before we move deeper, I need to speak directly to those who have remained fully present up to this point. There is a natural moment in every conversation where curiosity separates from commitment. Some people hear information like this as entertainment. Others recognize themselves inside it. The difference matters because what comes next requires more than casual interest. It requires attention. The next phase of understanding. This May 31st portal is not about collecting spiritual ideas or enjoying inspiring language. It is about recognizing a practical sequence that unfolds when a person reaches genuine readiness and encounters a moment of accelerated transformation. This is where things become specific. This is where the conversation moves beyond concepts and into lived experience. And if previous messages have ever reflected something you were feeling before you had words for it, if they have ever helped you understand your own inner landscape with greater clarity, then pay close attention to what follows. The journey unfolding beyond this portal extends far beyond a single day. The period stretching through June and into the summer carries implications that build directly upon what is happening now. Those who continue paying attention will not necessarily experience fewer challenges, but they will understand what those challenges mean. They will recognize opportunities when they appear. They will identify turning points while they are happening, rather than only seeing them in hindsight. The coming months will reveal a growing difference between those who remain conscious participants in their own transformation and those who drift back into unconscious routines. The distinction may appear subtle at first, but over time it becomes impossible to miss, which is why, as we prepare to explore what truly happens when this portal opens for those who are ready, there is one question worth asking yourself. Are you merely observing this moment, or are you prepared to step fully into it? Because the answer to that question determines everything that comes next. Before we move any deeper into what unfolds when this blue moon portal reaches its peak, there is an important misunderstanding that must be cleared away. If it is not addressed now, everything that follows can easily be interpreted through the wrong lens. The phrase 1,440 souls carries a certain gravity. It captures attention. It sparks curiosity. But it has also accumulated layers of confusion that often distract people from its true meaning. Many assume it refers to a fixed group of individuals who were somehow selected long ago, a predetermined circle separated from the rest of humanity by some invisible spiritual designation. They imagine a list that already exists, a cosmic distinction granted before life began, a status that belongs to some and excludes others. Yet that interpretation misses the deeper reality entirely. In many ways, it can become a subtle trap. It encourages comparison. It feeds the desire to feel exceptional. It creates separation where growth was meant to create connection. And when spiritual language begins serving the ego instead of awakening awareness, something essential is lost. The frequency represented by 1,440 is not about superiority. It is not about being chosen above others. It is not a title. It is not an identity badge. It is a state of being. It is a description of what happens when a person reaches a certain level of inner alignment with themselves. It reflects a condition in which honesty becomes stronger than avoidance, where growth becomes more important than comfort, and where awareness begins moving beyond ideas into direct experience. This is not knowledge collected from books, videos, teachings, or philosophies. It is something far more personal. It is the lived reality of someone who has repeatedly chosen truth over illusion, even when that truth was uncomfortable. It is the gradual development of a person who has stopped running from their own reflection and started learning from it instead. Seen this way, the 1,440 is not something you are born into. It is something you grow into. It emerges through countless moments that often appear insignificant at the time. It is built through private decisions, through difficult conversations with yourself, through nights when no one sees the work you are doing internally, through moments when it would be easier to pretend, easier to distract yourself, easier to continue old patterns, yet you choose awareness instead. Little by little, those choices accumulate. Little by little, they reshape the architecture of your inner world. Over time, they create a person who is capable of receiving deeper levels of clarity because they have demonstrated a willingness to act on the clarity they already possess. This is why the Blue Moon Portal on May 31st feels especially significant for those who resonate with this frequency. Not because they have been granted exclusive access to something unavailable to others, not because they deserve more than anyone else. The difference is much simpler. They have spent enough time preparing themselves internally that they can actually recognize what is being offered. The doorway opens for everyone. The invitation exists for everyone. The energy moves through the collective field without discrimination. But the ability to receive it depends upon the condition of the receiver. Just as sunlight pours equally across a landscape, yet only nourishes seeds that are ready to emerge, the portal offers its gifts universally, while being fully received only by those who have cultivated the readiness to recognize them. That readiness did not appear overnight. It was built. It was developed through experiences stretching across this month, and perhaps many months before it. Some of you may not even have realized what you were doing while it was happening. You may never have labeled it spiritual work. You may never have followed a formal practice or adopted a particular philosophy. Yet something inside you kept moving in the direction of greater authenticity. Something kept pulling you toward deeper self-examination. Something continued asking questions that could not be satisfied by surface-level answers. The fact that you are here now is not evidence of special status. It is evidence of movement. It reflects a journey already underway. The reason this message feels relevant is because your inner life has been evolving toward the frequency that allows you to recognize it. Content like this does not resonate simply because someone encounters it. It resonates because something inside them was already preparing to hear it. And that preparation is precisely why the opening of this portal matters. It arrives at a moment when many people have reached a threshold where clarity can finally land. Take a moment and think honestly about your own path, not how long you have been interested in spiritual ideas, not how many books you have read, teachings you have explored, or concepts you have collected. Ask yourself how long you have truly been engaged in the work of becoming more honest with yourself. How long have you been willing to sit with uncomfortable truths rather than escape them? How long have you been learning to recognize patterns that once controlled you unconsciously? How long have you been allowing life to refine you rather than merely reacting to it? Those are the questions that matter. Those are the experiences that shape readiness, and understanding that readiness becomes essential. Because what happens when a blue moon portal of this magnitude opens follows a sequence. It does not arrive as random inspiration. It unfolds through recognizable stages. The first stage begins in the hours surrounding the opening itself. This is where many people notice a sudden acceleration in the clarity that has been quietly developing during the pause of recent days. Information that once felt incomplete begins forming a complete picture. Questions that lingered without answers begin resolving themselves. Realizations that hovered at the edge of awareness move directly into conscious recognition. It is as if a veil becomes thinner. The mental filters that usually soften difficult truths lose some of their strength. The protective mechanisms that keep certain insights at a safe distance become less active. What emerges during this period can feel surprisingly direct. There is often a sense of seeing something exactly as it is, without the usual layers of interpretation, rationalization, or emotional distortion. For some people, this experience feels shocking because of its simplicity. The truth was there all along. It simply could not be fully acknowledged before now. Yet at the same time, there is a strange familiarity to it. The realization feels new and ancient simultaneously. It feels like discovering something you have never seen before, while also remembering something you have always known. Imagine encountering a person whose presence feels instantly recognizable, even though you have never met them in that context. That is the quality of clarity many experience during this phase. Nothing external has necessarily changed. Yet internally, everything suddenly appears illuminated. And what becomes visible in that illumination is where the next stage of the portal journey truly begins. What many people are not prepared for is how powerful genuine clarity can feel when it finally arrives without resistance. The first wave of this blue moon portal often catches people by surprise, not because it introduces something entirely new, but because it removes the distance that previously existed between you and what you already sensed was true. For weeks, perhaps even longer, certain realizations may have been circling around the edges of your awareness. You noticed them briefly. You felt them in quiet moments. They appeared in flashes during conversations, reflections, or moments of solitude. Yet there was always enough uncertainty, enough distraction, enough noise to keep them from fully settling into conscious recognition. When the portal opens, that distance begins to collapse. The truth moves closer. The signal becomes stronger. And for many people, that experience can feel surprisingly intense. Not because anything harmful is happening, but because clarity changes the rules. Once you genuinely know something, you can no longer comfortably pretend you do not know it. Once a reality becomes visible, maintaining old narratives requires far more effort than simply facing what is there. This is why periods of awakening often feel emotionally significant. The intensity does not come from the truth itself. It comes from the responsibility that accompanies seeing clearly. Suddenly, situations that have been carefully managed rather than genuinely resolved begin demanding a different kind of response. Patterns that were tolerated become difficult to ignore. Decisions that were postponed begin asking for movement. What was once hidden behind uncertainty stands directly in front of you, asking to be acknowledged. If this happens during the portal, resist the temptation to immediately escape from it. Do not rush to fill every quiet moment with stimulation. Do not automatically reach for the distractions that have always been available whenever discomfort appears. Do not drown the signal beneath endless activity simply because the clarity feels stronger than usual. Allow yourself to remain with it. Let the insight complete itself. Let the understanding arrive without interruption. Let the truth speak in its full voice, rather than reducing it to a volume that feels more convenient. The intensity is temporary. The portal is not designed to sustain this level of awareness forever. It is a passageway, not a permanent destination. Yet what matters is what you receive while the passageway remains open. The insights you fully acknowledge, the emotions you allow yourself to feel, the truths you stop negotiating with. Those become the foundation you carry forward into the next phase of your journey. And as this process unfolds, something else begins happening almost simultaneously. It is subtle at first, yet extraordinarily important. Your perception of what matters starts changing, not through dramatic revelation, not through some sudden external event. Instead, a quiet reorganization begins taking place inside your awareness. The things that have been consuming enormous amounts of your attention often start appearing differently. Problems that felt overwhelming begin shrinking to their actual size. Worries that dominated your mental landscape lose some of their apparent importance. This does not necessarily happen because those issues disappear. It happens because you finally see them without the distortions created by fear, habit, and repetitive thinking. Anxiety has a way of enlarging things. Unexamined assumptions have a way of assigning significance where significance does not truly belong. During the Blue Moon portal, many of those distortions temporarily weaken. You begin seeing proportion more accurately. What once seemed enormous may reveal itself as manageable. What once felt all-consuming may reveal itself as only one small part of a much larger picture. At the same time, another shift occurs. Certain aspects of your life that have been pushed into the background begin moving forward into focus. Dreams you postponed, relationships you neglected, creative impulses you dismissed, personal callings you continuously promised yourself you would address later. These elements often reveal their true importance during the portal. Suddenly, they no longer appear secondary. They no longer feel like optional considerations to be handled after everything else is finished. Instead, they reveal themselves as central pieces of the life you are actually trying to build. This reordering may be one of the greatest gifts the Blue Moon offers. Much of human struggle comes from misplaced attention. People spend extraordinary amounts of energy responding to what feels urgent while neglecting what is genuinely meaningful. They become trapped in cycles where immediate demands consume all available resources, leaving little room for the deeper priorities that give life direction and purpose. The portal briefly interrupts that pattern. It allows you to see your life from a perspective that is not dominated by pressure, fear, or endless urgency. It reveals the landscape more accurately. It shows what deserves your energy and what merely demands it. When this happens, pay attention. Do not dismiss the reordering. Do not rush back into old priorities simply because they are familiar. Allow the new perspective to teach you something. Then, as the days following the portal unfold, specifically from May 31st through June 3rd, translate that awareness into action. The action does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to transform your entire life overnight. In fact, one of the most common mistakes people make is believing that meaningful change requires enormous gestures. More often, transformation begins with a single decision, one adjustment, one visible action that reflects what you now know to be true. Choose one thing that aligns with what genuinely matters. One choice that honors the priority revealed during the portal, rather than the urgency that previously dominated your attention. That small action becomes a declaration. It signals that your life is beginning to organize itself around truth rather than habit. And often, that single choice becomes the doorway through which an entirely different future begins to emerge. Then we arrive at what may be the most overlooked phase of the entire sequence. This is the stage that many people never recognize because they are not paying attention in the right way. Yet those who have cultivated awareness often notice it almost immediately. During the opening of the Blue Moon portal and throughout the days that follow, especially between May 31st and June 3rd, there is often an unusual quality surrounding encounters, conversations, opportunities, ideas, and moments of connection. These experiences may appear ordinary on the surface. They rarely announce themselves dramatically. They do not arrive accompanied by certainty or fanfare. Instead, they emerge quietly. A conversation takes an unexpected turn. An idea appears with a sense of natural alignment that feels different from ordinary thinking. A new connection carries an inexplicable feeling of familiarity despite being completely new. An opportunity presents itself in a form that might once have been overlooked, but now seems impossible to ignore. The difference is not always in the event itself. The difference is in your ability to recognize it. The pause that preceded the portal has been preparing your perception. It has been clearing enough internal noise that certain things can finally be seen for what they truly are. This is why presence becomes so important during these days. Not anxious vigilance, not obsessive searching for signs, not exhausting yourself by trying to force meaning into every interaction. The invitation is something much simpler. Remain awake, remain available, remain genuinely present with what is unfolding around you. Notice what captures your attention naturally. Notice what feels alive. Notice what carries a subtle sense of recognition, even when it appears unfamiliar. Somewhere within this window, something may appear that belongs not to the chapter you are leaving behind, but to the chapter waiting ahead. It may come through a person, a conversation, a realization, an invitation, a possibility. Whatever form it takes, its significance will depend less on how loudly it arrives, and more on whether you are fully present enough to recognize it when it does. Now we arrive at one of the most important ideas connected to this entire Blue Moon window, and it is also one of the most misunderstood. The phrase next timeline is used constantly in spiritual conversations, yet very few people stop long enough to examine what it actually means. Because once you understand it correctly, everything about the portal opening on May 31st begins to make practical sense, rather than remaining a beautiful but abstract concept. Many people imagine a next timeline as though it were another reality waiting somewhere beyond reach. They picture a different dimension, a parallel existence, or a future that suddenly appears when the universe decides the timing is right. They imagine that if they can somehow raise their vibration high enough, repeat the correct affirmations, or perform the perfect ritual, an entirely different life will simply materialize around them. While those ideas can sound inspiring, they often distract people from the deeper truth of how transformation actually unfolds. The reality is far more intimate, far more personal, and far more powerful. The next timeline is not somewhere you travel. It is something you create through the gradual evolution of who you become. It is the version of life that emerges when your internal foundation changes enough that your choices begin coming from a different place than before. Every reality you currently experience has been shaped by countless decisions. Your relationships, your routines, your work, your priorities, your habits, your reactions, your expectations, even the opportunities you notice and the opportunities you ignore. All of these things have been influenced by the version of you that existed before this moment. They were built by the person you were at the beginning of this month, before the Scorpio full moon exposed what had been hidden beneath the surface, before the stillness of recent days revealed what constant activity had been concealing. Before this blue moon portal gathered every lesson, every realization, and every unanswered question into a single moment of undeniable clarity. That earlier version of you made choices that were perfectly consistent with the awareness available at the time. Those choices were not mistakes. They were reflections of who you were then. Yet something important has happened since then. Quietly, gradually, beneath the surface, you have been changing. Perhaps not in ways visible to the outside world, perhaps not in ways anyone else would immediately recognize. But inner transformation rarely announces itself. It accumulates, one realization at a time, one difficult truth at a time, one moment of honesty at a time. Eventually, those moments reach a threshold where they begin altering the person who is making the decisions. And that threshold is exactly what this blue moon portal represents. The version of you standing on the other side of this opening is not identical to the version who entered this month. The person emerging from this process has seen things differently, felt things differently, understood things differently. They have allowed clarity to arrive instead of resisting it. They have permitted priorities to reorganize themselves according to what genuinely matters, rather than what merely demands attention. They have become willing to receive the encounters, opportunities, and insights arriving during this period instead of automatically filtering them through old assumptions. That shift changes everything. Not because it instantly transforms the external world overnight, but because it changes the source from which future choices are made. And when choices change, realities eventually change with them. The future begins evolving in a different direction. One decision leads to another. One action creates conditions for the next action. One moment of alignment generates another. Over time, what once seemed like a completely different life begins appearing naturally as the consequence of a completely different way of being. This is what people call the next timeline. It is not magic. It is not fantasy. It is the visible outcome of an invisible transformation that has finally matured enough to influence how you move through the world. Relationships that once felt natural may begin revealing whether they can evolve alongside your growth or whether they were built for a version of you that no longer exists. Career paths that once felt acceptable may suddenly feel deeply aligned or profoundly out of place. Opportunities that previously passed unnoticed may now stand out with surprising clarity because your perception has changed. The world itself has not necessarily become different. Your relationship to it has. And that changes what becomes possible. This is why May 31st matters. Not because it magically changes your life, because it offers the most complete opportunity of this entire cycle to receive the internal update that eventually changes your life. You are standing at a threshold. The doorway is open. What happens next depends upon whether you are willing to walk through it or remain attached to what is familiar simply because it feels safe. Familiarity can be comforting. It can also become a prison when it no longer reflects who you are becoming. There comes a moment in every period of growth when remaining the same becomes more uncomfortable than changing. Many people are approaching that moment now, and that is precisely why this portal feels so significant. Before we move further, I want to speak directly to those who stayed present through this entire journey, because there is something important that deserves to be said openly. Spaces like this were never created merely for passive consumption. They were not built for people who enjoy spiritual ideas as entertainment before returning unchanged to the patterns they have always known. They exist for individuals who are genuinely committed to understanding themselves more deeply, for people who are willing to move beyond surface-level explanations, For those who feel that there is always another layer beneath what most conversations are willing to explore, the souls who resonate with this frequency are not looking for comforting slogans. They are looking for truth. They are looking for understanding that changes how they experience their lives. And what comes next builds directly upon that intention. The material unfolding after this blue moon window is designed to challenge existing assumptions about lunar cycles and energetic timing at a foundational level, not by adding more information to what you already know, but by inviting you to see familiar concepts through an entirely different lens. Much of what people believe they understand about lunar energy remains limited to surface observations. They recognize emotional shifts. They track astrological movements. They follow rituals and practices. Yet there are deeper mechanisms operating beneath those experiences, patterns connected to personal growth, awakening, and inner development that many never fully explore. The understanding that emerges from examining those deeper layers changes how every future cycle is experienced. It transforms lunar energy from something you observe into something you consciously work with. It changes your relationship with timing itself. And for those who are ready, that shift can influence every decision made throughout the months ahead. The people who learn to recognize these patterns do not necessarily become more powerful because they are doing more than others. They become more effective because they understand what is happening while it is happening. They stop moving against the current. They begin moving with it. And that difference becomes increasingly visible as the rest of the year unfolds, which is why the choice in front of you now is not simply whether to continue listening. It is whether you are willing to keep stepping deeper into a process that is already transforming the way you see yourself, your life, and the future waiting beyond this blue moon portal. Because what comes next is not the conclusion of the journey. In many ways, it is only the beginning.